I think an important issue that we need to consider, and we do consider in a lot of ways, but I don't think it goes far enough, is the whole question of well-being. Now, within education, we've talked about student well-being for a long time, and I think COVID had a big impact on our views around well-being, the issues that we had around isolation in lockdown, and so on, where society really contracted down to the smallest unit, which was the family, or in some cases, of course, the individual. And it was recognised as we went through that period that there was a necessity for people to bubble together because some people, and often it was the most vulnerable people in society, were becoming very isolated. Since lockdown, we've seen lots of issues around things like school refusal, emotionally based absence, and so on. And I think those things are very important for us to consider within education and also outside of education in the wider workforce. Because what's happening with children and young people, teenagers, and so on now is going to translate into the society as a whole in which we live. I think it's becoming more widely recognised that people working in schools need well-being support, and there are various groups that offer well-being badges for schools to demonstrate that they've done some work towards securing the well-being of everybody within the school environment. And certainly things like school counsellors are becoming more common, therapists working with schools, working with students in school, and increasingly working with staff in schools. It was, I don't know, I guess about 10 or 15 years ago, maybe not quite as long as 15, but certainly 10 years ago, that I suggested the idea to the head teacher that I was working for at the time that we should perhaps consider having a therapist that worked with the school, and that just as is the case in many other professions, there is an opportunity for people to receive counselling or supervision or whatever you want to call it on a routine basis. In fact, within some professions, such as therapists and counsellors, there is a requirement for those people to have supervision. And I think in some of the most challenging areas of education, in particular those who are working within specialist education fields, I think there is a case for having that in place where once a fortnight, once a month, something like that, everybody goes for a half-hour therapy session or half-hour supervision session, whatever you want to call it. Although we do need to get away from the stigmatization of certain words that make people feel like if they're receiving that kind of intervention, then somehow it's a deficit within themselves, because it isn't. So I felt this was a good idea that on a regular frequency, everybody was able to have that input from somebody else just to give them a place to go and offload. The the idea at the time wasn't taken forward, although in a form it's been implemented since. Now, that could take many forms, and it could be a group session, it could be an individual session. It depends what each person wants and needs at different times. Where I think the whole question of well-being hasn't yet extended to, not in a significant enough way to have the kind of impact that it needs to have, is I don't think it's extended into school leadership. There are some very pressured situations. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I think school leadership in itself is more stressful, more pressured than other aspects of working in a school, because I don't believe it is. I think it's very unique in terms of the way the pressures of working in a school fall upon school leaders. And I think there's a difference there. And the higher up the ladder, for want of a better word, you go, the smaller your support network becomes as you do it. Teachers can talk to other teachers, teaching assistants can talk to other teaching assistants, or they can all talk to one another. School leaders, and particularly head teachers, need to find groups with whom they feel safe to talk, and those aren't naturally around within the buildings, within the schools, within the organisations they work. Now, I can't say that I know what systems multi academy trusts put in place. They have a natural opportunity there for groups of people doing the job of head teacher to work together to support one another's well-being. I don't know whether that happens, but it certainly could. Within a single academy trust or a maintained school, it's a little more difficult because, as I've said, the natural group isn't there. And whilst it is true to say that head teachers meet together on a regular basis, and I always found those meetings, not necessarily even the formal meetings, but the informal conversations I had with head teacher colleagues were always very useful because you actually begin to understand that it doesn't really matter what sector you're working in, whether it's special school, mainstream school, or whatever, the pressures actually are the same for all of us. The difference is often scale. And sometimes those people who are in bigger schools with bigger staffing, with bigger SLTs, are actually in a better position because they have more opportunity to delegate some of those responsibilities, and for want of a better word, the stress is shared. In small schools or in schools with a small senior leadership team, the stresses aren't so shared as much, and they can often fall on one person. And when that happens, it can be very difficult to get out of that. Now, again, some local authorities have systems in place. Some local authorities have people who can work with head teachers to support them during those times. But I certainly think it's something that groups need to look at. I think it's something that local authorities, multi academy trusts, and individual head teachers need to look at. What can we do to support one another? And of course, now that I'm outside of that, but still within the system, as it were, what can I do to help that? It, it is a truth that I probably wouldn't have understood until I did the job. That unless you are or have been a head teacher, you really don't know what that job is like. You think you do, because I know that I thought I did. But the truth is, you don't. So, what can we do then to help one another? And I think that is a key question, something that we need to look at and to consider and work out what do we need and how can we work together to support that need. And I think that is really, for me, the next stage in developing good well-being support in schools.